Sometimes, the loudest truth comes from the smallest voice. For 2 years, Sophie lived in silence. Doctors said it was trauma. Counselors said it was grief. Her parents, both police officers, were gone, and the world told her it was an accident. But Sophie knew something else. She just couldn't speak it. Until the day of the trial. The room was thick with tension. Arguments had circled for hours. Evidence had piled up, but something vital was missing. Then, Sophie stood. She walked slowly down the aisle, her hand brushing the fur of Aegis, her father's old K9 partner. And then she said the words no one expected. "Tell them what happened to Daddy." Gasps filled the room. Lawyers froze. And in that instant, the balance of the case shifted, not because of new evidence, but because a child found her voice, and a dog never forgot his duty. Greyhaven's winter did not arrive so much as settle, like a long, unblinking stare. The cold moved through the seaside town with a patient certainty, crawling under doors and into rib cages, tasting the damp in every board and beam. Shutters rattled whenever the wind leaned in. Paint peeled from clapboard walls in long, curled tongues. The air smelled of salt and old rope, of harbors left to fend for themselves. A gull cried somewhere out of sight, a thin, metallic sound. Then the town fell back into its hush. Inside a narrow, 2-story rental that slouched against its own foundation, a room had been claimed by winter. The window pane was feathered with frost around the edges, a hairline crack running diagonally from one corner like a scratch on glass. Someone had taped over the crack with clear tape that had long since clouded. Beneath it, on a thin mattress, Elsa lay. 8 years old, and small for it. She seemed smaller still, against the mattress's tired fabric, her face the color of old paper. Her breathing came shallow and quick, a bird flutter inside her chest. Mira knelt beside her. Sisters, born minutes apart. And yet Mira had always seemed older by miles. Her hair, dark and straight, was tied back with a piece of blue yarn that had once fastened a tag to a grocery bag. She had the quiet way of a child who had learned to move through rooms without disturbing them. She pressed the back of her hand to Elsa's forehead and swallowed. The heat there was not the heat of blankets and breath. It was the clean, frightening heat that burned up from illness. "It's okay," Mira said softly, as if speaking too loudly might drive the breath from Elsa's lungs. "I'm here." A kettle they could no longer afford to run sat cold on a hot plate in the corner. The last can of soup, condensed chicken noodle, was gone, and the can itself stood rinsed and drying on the sill, as if the memory of its usefulness were worth saving. A pair of socks hung from the radiator that sometimes woke to life with a clank and a sigh, and then went quiet again. On the floor by the mattress, a backpack slumped like a tired shoulder. 2 months had passed since their mother's laugh had filled this room. That was how Mira measured it. Not by days or weeks, but by the absence of that sound. The way a person measured the sea by the dark line it left on stone. Their mother had been a woman whose hands showed her living. Knuckles scarred by work, nails clean, palms warm when she cupped a cheek. She had used those hands to turn a frayed quilt, to open soup cans, to part hair, and find the place where a barrette would hold. Then, one night, her breathing turned wrong, and the ambulance took too long, and the phone calls went unanswered. The landlord came a week later to lock every room but this one, a collection of padlocks clacking like teeth. Until the paperwork, he'd said, and left. Mira had not cried in front of Elsa since. It wasn't that she believed tears were useless. It was that Elsa watched her like a compass watches north. So Mira learned to hold her face still, to let the ache settle in her ribs, where it would not spill out and wet the blankets. Now she dampened a washcloth with the cold water they had left and touched it to Elsa's lips. Elsa turned slightly toward the touch, a child's instinct even when sleep was heavy and fever heavier. The little hand that had, once, wrapped around their mother's finger, curled against the blanket. "Do you remember the story about the lighthouse?" Mira asked. Her voice was a low thread in the winter air. "How it keeps watch when others sleep. I think you liked that part." She tried to smile. "I'm the lighthouse now. I can be bright enough for both of us." Outside, wind shouldered the house. The walls answered with a small groan. Somewhere a loose length of gutter tapped in a steady, patient rhythm, like a spoon against the side of a mug. Mira listened to it the way one listens to a clock when morning hasn't yet been earned. She pressed a hand to her own chest to steady it. The clinic would still be open. It had to be. If they could make it there, if anyone would even look up from a computer screen and see them, someone could put an oxygen mask on Elsa's face and make that bird's wing slow and fold. She imagined the bright lights, the steady hands, the questions that might come, and the answers she did not have. The thought made her throat tighten, but the sight of Elsa's chest rising too fast was a sharper thing, and it cut through fear like a blade. "We're going," she said softly, making the words into a promise in the cold air. "I won't let you stay here with this." She tucked the threadbare quilt more closely around her sister's shoulders. The fabric, once a friendly yellow, had dulled to the color of old straw, but it still remembered the shape of a child. Mira reached for the backpack, shook it out, and took stock. A half-full bottle of water, an old paperback with a cracked spine that had belonged to their mother, a scarf whose fringe had more knots than threads, 2 buttons, 3 coins. She slid the scarf over Elsa's mouth and nose. She found the last pair of clean socks and pulled them over Elsa's hands. When she lifted her sister, she did it with the practice of 2 months. Elsa was light, but the carrying required more than arms. It required resolve in the back and steady feet, and the kind of quiet bravery that does not announce itself. Mira rose slowly, ensuring Elsa's chin nestled over her shoulder, that the scarf sat right, that the blanket held. Elsa made a small sound, not quite a word, and Mira hushed whatever it might have been with the side of her face against Elsa's temple. On the far wall, below a nail where a picture had once hung, shadows wavered. 2 children, one whole because the other was held. The sight stole something inside Mira's chest and replaced it with something else. She stood still, letting the stealing and replacing finish, then turned toward the door. Her fingers found the cold metal of the knob. She paused long enough to listen. To the kettle that would not boil, to the radiator that would not sing, to the memory of their mother's laugh turning corners in this room. And then she stepped out. The hallway smelled of dust and winter shoes. The stairway creaked like a man leaning, and the banister wobbled under Mira's guiding hand. At the bottom, the outside door waited with its breath held in a line of light beneath. She pulled it open, and Greyhaven's winter put its hand on her face. For a heartbeat, everything in her wanted to turn back, to stack blankets, to invent a warm story out of cold fabric. Then Elsa's breath fluttered against her neck, too fast, and the wanting turned into motion. Mira pulled the door shut behind them and stepped into the wind. She kept her chin down and her eyes sharp, counting cracks in the sidewalk through her shoes, as if they were steps across a river. Somewhere close, the harbor shifted. Lines creaked. Water licked pilings. The town's weathered bones talking to themselves. Mira drew the blanket tighter around Elsa and started toward where she knew the clinic sat, with its clean windows and fluorescent hum, a lighthouse of another kind. She did not know if anyone there would see them. She only knew what she had promised in a room where the past still warmed the corners. I'm the lighthouse now. And so she went, carrying her sister, the winter pressed close, the town watching through its salt fog breath. The street took her the way a shoreline takes a tide, without comment, as if this were the only direction left to go. Mira settled Elsa's weight higher against her back and set a pace she believed she could hold. Her boots had been somebody else's once, the soles worn thin enough to read the seams of the sidewalk. Cold found those seams with a kind of glee. It climbed through rubber like a clever thief and made a home in her toes. They passed the bakery with its window papered over. A dusting of flour had become a permanent thing along the sill, as if the last batch of bread had left behind a ghost. A man in a thick coat swept the stoop with slow, careful strokes. He didn't look up. Maybe he did, and decided to keep his eyes where the broom went. People had reasons for what they could and could not see. Mira did not waste her breath on any of them. A bus bench held a woman and a paper bag and a vacant stare. The wind pushed at the bag's edges and made a quiet crackle. The woman's hands were both gloved, yet she kept rubbing them together, as if friction could argue successfully with winter. She glanced at the girls only long enough to note that they were not the bus she was waiting for. Almost there, Mira said for Elsa's ears alone, though she had not yet convinced herself of it. You're doing good, Els. So good. The words rose and fogged, then vanished into air already full of other people's words, as if speech itself could freeze, then fall. The neighborhood changed by small degrees as she went. Porches gave way to stoops, stoops to flat thresholds, then glass doors, and the kinds of lights that made things look clean, whether they were or not. Mira could feel Elsa's breath against her neck, still too fast, still too shallow, and each breath tugged her forward like a bell on a collar. She shifted again, careful of Elsa's head, careful of the scarf over her mouth. A single cough trembled through her sister, then a pause that made Mira count quietly. 1, 2, 3, 4, until the breath resumed. A traffic light clicked from red to green without any cars to hear it. Farther on, a delivery truck idled while a driver unloaded boxes onto a dolly, the man's breath blowing from him in white puffs like a locomotive. He set one box at a time on the sidewalk, neat, square, sensible. He did not turn his head. Mira thought of how long the world had kept moving after their mother's last breath, how every machine had continued to do what it had been designed to do. She didn't blame the truck or the light. Even anger took heat she could not spare. When the clinic's sign came into view, Mapleford Community Clinic in block letters, each one a little island of light in the late afternoon, it felt like the faintest slackening in the rope pulled tight inside her chest. The glow climbed across the sidewalk toward her, a softening of winter's hard mouth. She told herself not to run, that running might jostle Elsa's breathing into a worse shape, that she had to be a steady thing now, and not the panic ringing in her bones. A gust caught her then, lateral and mean, and she turned her shoulder into it to shield Elsa's face. The gust staggered her a step and set the torn hem of the blanket flapping behind them like a tired flag. She waited for it to finish speaking, and then moved on. The entrance opened by a ramp. The glass door reflected back their picture. One child twice, one barely awake, one carrying. And for an instant, Mira didn't know which one looked older. At the base of the ramp, she paused. "We're going in," she whispered into Elsa's hair. "They have lights and heat and people who fix things. Do you remember the way Mom used to say the word doctor, like it was a door that would open when you knocked?" She took the first step up the ramp, then the next. The aluminum rail was cold through her palm. A row of pines along the parking lot exhaled their resin smell into the air, and the scent reached her like a memory of summer so faint it hurt. The door's metal handle had fingerprints on it, ghosted in the condensation, proof that other hands had been here, other bodies standing in front of other hurts. Mira tightened her grip on the handle and pulled. The bell above the door chimed. Warmth moved over her face. The antiseptic tang of clean floors and the faint, weary smell of coffee that had been sitting too long welcomed her as best they knew how. A reception desk sat beneath a poster announcing flu shots, and another reminding people to be kind to staff. Behind the desk, a man with sandy hair and tired eyes glanced up, then blinked and stood. "Can I help?" he started, but Mira was already moving toward him, careful but quick. "My sister," she said. She can't catch her breath." The words scraped up from somewhere that had gone too long unused. She heard the rawness in her own voice, felt the burn rise behind her eyes, and fought it back. "Please." The receptionist looked past her at Elsa's face, and something changed in his posture, a shift that admitted the facts. He clicked the phone toward him with 2 fingers. "One moment," he said. "We'll get—" A white coat moved into the space beside him, as if the coat had been waiting just out of sight for its cue. Dr. Harold Pike was neat where the town was not. His hair lay flat. His glasses were clean. He carried his mouth like a rule. "Insurance?" he asked, not unkindly. And then, as if the words had been bound together for years, "Identification. Guardianship papers." Mira shook her head once. She knew better than to let the panic into her voice now. "We don't have... She's very sick. We just need... Please." "Without documentation," he said, and the word documentation filled the room like steam. "We cannot admit a minor. There is a process. This is a clinic. The emergency department is at Seaside Medical Center." His eyes flicked to the receptionist as if to ensure the sentence had been properly punctuated in the air. The receptionist's hand hovered over the phone, not dialing, not hanging up. His eyes slid toward Elsa and back again. "Doctor," he tried. Pike lifted a single finger. "Policy." Not a scold, just a key turned in a lock. "If you take her there, they will have the resources. We do not." Mira felt heat rise in her face, a traitor heat in a winter body. For a moment, the room went wavy, like air above a road in July, and she felt herself reach for the counter to steady the picture back into place. Her throat burned, as if she had swallowed the wind whole. She could see Elsa's lashes resting against her cheeks, a fine black line, and she could not make sense of a world that would weigh those lashes against a word like policy. "Please," she said again, quietly this time, because quiet was what she had left. "Just help her breathe." The receptionist's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, his mouth compressed, then flattened. Pike shook his head as if the decision were weather, and he the one appointed to forecast it. "I'm sorry." The bell above the door chimed again, a small, bright sound that should have belonged to a better moment. Mira turned. She did not trust herself to speak further without breaking something she would need later. She pushed the door with her shoulder, careful of Elsa's weight, and felt the warm air fall away from her like a blanket pulled by someone else's hand. Outside, the light had thinned, sliding toward evening. The wind met them, as if they'd never left. Mira stood for a heartbeat on the threshold, 1 foot in warmth, 1 in winter, and then stepped down the ramp. "It's okay," she told Elsa, because there was no better magic to offer. "We'll find another door." She adjusted the blanket and the scarf, hugged her sister closer, and set her face toward the street, where the town prepared to put its lights on, 1 square window at a time. The antiseptic tang clung to the air inside Mapleford Community Clinic, sharp enough to sting Mira's nose as she stepped across the threshold. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed in their sterile cages, spilling a pale glow across tiled floors, scrubbed to a shine that didn't quite hide the scuff marks of shoes that had dragged here before her. For the briefest moment, she felt relief, a sense that she had crossed into warmth and safety, that here someone would see Elsa and understand. The receptionist looked up from his monitor, a man in his 40s, his hair thinning and sandy, with the kind of fatigue that gathered under eyes after years of watching problems walk in the door. He blinked at Mira, then at the bundle clutched to her back. His posture shifted, just slightly, but Mira saw it. His hand twitched toward the phone on the desk, as if instinct had told him to call someone. "My sister." Mira's voice cracked, unused and brittle. She adjusted Elsa carefully so that the man could see her pale face, lips dry and faintly blue, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She can't breathe right. Please." The receptionist opened his mouth, but before words could form, another presence filled the space. Dr. Harold Pike moved like a door closing. His white coat gleamed, crisp in its creases, as though ironed that morning with the same precision he applied to his speech. His face was lean, his jaw squared, glasses perched low so that his eyes peered over them, assessing before they even listened. He didn't ask what was wrong. He asked what proof Mira had that her sister belonged here. "Insurance card? Identification?" His voice was calm, not cruel, yet all the more cutting for its lack of hesitation. Mira blinked at him, unsure she'd heard correctly. We don't have that, but she's sick. Please, she needs help now." Dr. Pike's expression didn't waver. "I'm sorry," he said, though his tone carried no softness, only the finality of a stamp on paper. "Without documentation, we cannot admit her." The receptionist flinched, his eyes flicking to Elsa again. He shifted in his chair as though bracing himself against the impact of words he could not stop. Mira's knees threatened to give way beneath her. She tightened her arms around Elsa's legs, felt the weight grow heavier, not because Elsa had changed, but because hope had. "She's not breathing right," Mira whispered, panic pressing her throat closed. "Seaside Medical Center handles emergency intakes," Dr. Pike said, already turning, his coat swaying slightly with the motion. "They have the staff and resources. This is policy." Policy. The word landed like a lock clicking shut. The receptionist opened his mouth, shut it again. His shoulders hunched inward, his sympathy spilling out only in the downturn of his gaze. Mira stared at him, desperate. But his eyes were fixed on the screen before him, as if the glow might shield him from her need. He wanted to help. She could see it. But he would not. Not against the weight of the white coat. Mira's throat burned, her chest tight with heat and humiliation. "Please," she tried again, but her voice was barely a breath now, as if begging had scraped it raw. Elsa moaned softly against her back, a sound so faint, Mira felt it more than she heard it. The sound jolted her, reminding her that every second wasted here was a second stolen from Elsa's breath. The clinic's lights seemed too bright now, cruel in their indifference. The poster on the wall, "Be kind, everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle," glared at her like a joke told at the wrong time. Mira turned, her body rigid with the effort of not collapsing. The bell above the door chimed when she pushed it open. The warmth fell away instantly, the cold seizing her skin like an old enemy waiting for her return. For a heartbeat, she lingered in the doorway, caught between two worlds, the sterile light of a place that could help but wouldn't, and the brutal wind outside that offered nothing but honesty. She stepped into the night, the cold carved into her lungs, but she refused to cough. Her eyes stung, but no tears came. She had learned already that tears only froze in the wind. She adjusted Elsa carefully, pulling the blanket tighter, pressing her own cheek against her sister's temple to share what little warmth she had. Elsa's breaths were weaker now, her body limp in Mira's arms. "It's okay," Mira whispered into the dark, her words trembling. "I'll find another way. I won't stop." Behind her, the glass door swung shut with a soft click. Inside, the receptionist watched her silhouette vanish into the mist curling across the street. His hands hovered above the desk, useless. He swallowed, then lowered his gaze once more, burying guilt beneath routine. Mira moved forward, each step an act of defiance against the weight crushing her chest. The street lamps flickered overhead, halos of light blurred by fog. She looked neither left nor right, only forward, because to pause was to lose Elsa completely. Her throat burned with unshed words, with the scream she hadn't allowed herself to release inside those clean walls. The night pressed closer. The town was still, shuttered windows closing them out. Elsa stirred faintly, a cough rattling like paper. Mira's arms trembled, but she held on, whispering again and again, as if repetition could make it true. "I'm the lighthouse now. I'll shine enough for both of us." And with those words, she kept walking, past the bakery's darkened windows, past the indifferent man sweeping snow, past every closed door, carrying her sister deeper into the cold, not knowing that on another street, a man and his dog were already listening for the sound of her steps. The sea at Greyhaven never forgot to remind a man of what he'd lost. Jonathan Hale walked its shoreline with his collar turned up against the wind, boots sinking in the damp sand where the tide had only recently withdrawn. The surf dragged and broke in slow thunder, white froth curling over dark water, pulling back like hands reluctant to let go. Overhead, gulls wheeled with their sharp cries, their wings tilted against the slate-colored sky. Beside him, Aegis trotted at an even pace, paws pressing prints into the sand that the waves threatened to erase. The German shepherd's sable coat rippled against the wind, ears pricked forward, amber eyes alert. Every so often he looked up at his handler, as though measuring Jonathan's silence, gauging whether it was the thoughtful kind or the dangerous kind. Jonathan's own gaze stretched far beyond the horizon, though the horizon gave nothing back. At 61, his hair was silver at the temples, the kind that catches faint light and holds it, but his face carried deeper shadows. Fine lines creased around his eyes, not from laughter, but from years of looking at things too long, trying to see answers where none came. His shoulders were still broad, his frame lean, the discipline of years in boardrooms and charities and dinners clinging to him like an old suit. Yet there was a stiffness in his gait, a half-forgotten injury that winter's damp always remembered before he did. He had once been a man people recognized on magazine covers, in newspaper columns, his name synonymous with numbers that climbed upward, empires built from careful investments and sharper instincts. He had worn tailored suits and answered to investors with a smile that suggested nothing could crack the foundation beneath him. But foundations lie. He knew that now. All it had taken was a single night, a rural hospital too small for its own needs, a waiting room with its dim clock ticking into eternity, while the one life he would have given everything for slipped away beyond locked double doors. Emily. Her name was always there, quiet as breath. His daughter, his only child. 8 years old, with hair that had never stayed in place no matter how many ribbons her mother tied in it. She had laughed like sunlight through glass, sudden and warm, impossible to ignore. He had held her hand in that waiting room, felt its heat fading, and when the doctor finally stepped out, shaking his head, Jonathan had stood still as if the world had ended, but refused to admit it. That was 4 years ago. He had sold the house with its glass staircase and sprawling lawn, shut down the meetings, silenced the invitations. He moved to Greyhaven, not because it offered peace. He didn't believe in peace anymore, but because it offered obscurity. A man could walk the beach here and not be recognized, not be asked about the markets, not be told what a shame, what a tragedy. In Greyhaven, the only thing that asked anything of him was the sea, and the sea asked only that he listen. Aegis had come to him not long after, an animal bred for command and loyalty, once trained as a K9, but retired too soon after an injury that made him unfit for the field. Jonathan hadn't wanted the dog at first. He told himself he was past companionship, that silence was enough. But Aegis had a way of standing near him without demanding, of watching him without pity. On nights when Jonathan couldn't close his eyes for fear of seeing Emily's face pale beneath fluorescent lights, Aegis lay across the doorway like a sentinel, steady and immovable. In time, Jonathan realized he needed the dog in the same way he needed breath, quiet, constant, unseen, until absence threatened. Today, as they moved along the sand, Jonathan's steps slowed. His eyes were on the water, but Aegis's head turned inland. His ears shifted, nostrils flaring. A low sound rose from deep in his chest. Not a growl, not yet. Just awareness made audible. Jonathan felt the tug on the leash, subtle but insistent. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice low, weathered by disuse. He followed Aegis's gaze toward the town, between the skeletal shapes of docks and the fog rolling through side streets. There was nothing to see, just the dim glow of a lamp above a shuttered shop, the distant rattle of a loose sign. But Jonathan had learned to trust Aegis's instincts more than his own. The leash quivered in his hand again, and he let it slacken. The dog stood poised, one paw lifted, ears sharp as blades. Jonathan exhaled slowly. The cold air burned in his chest, reminding him he was still here, still walking, still carrying a weight he couldn't put down. Memories tugged at him, even in moments like this. Emily had loved dogs. She had begged for one each Christmas, each birthday. He had always said later, when things slowed down, when the meetings eased. He had believed there would always be another year. Now Aegis was here, not for Emily, but because she was gone. And Jonathan often wondered if that was the cruelest part, that the things we give come only when it's too late to give them to the ones who asked. The waves crashed louder against the rocks, as if answering something unspoken. Jonathan tightened his scarf against the wind, looked down at Aegis. and gave a nod. "All right," he murmured. "Lead on." The dog tugged slightly toward the narrow streets that stretched inland, streets that smelled of mist and iron, where lights flickered in the fog. Jonathan followed, his long coat trailing behind him, the man and dog cutting a silhouette against the grey of sea and sky. He didn't know what they would find. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. But as his boots left the sand for the cracked pavement of town, Jonathan felt that rarest of things stir inside him. Not peace, not yet, but a reason to move faster than the sea's pull. The fog had thickened as Jonathan and Aegis moved off the shoreline, swallowing the narrow streets of Greyhaven in a colourless shroud. Street lamps glowed like dim lanterns in the mist, their light struggling against the weight of winter. One lamp flickered, buzzing as if in protest, its halo trembling over cracked pavement. It was beneath that light that Jonathan saw her. A girl, small, too small to be carrying what she carried. At first, the image barely registered. A trick of the fog, perhaps, another shadow in the endless grey. But then the shape sharpened. A thin figure wrapped in a fraying coat, a bundle on her back that shifted with the uneven rhythm of shallow breaths. The girl's legs trembled as she stepped into the glow, her boots scraping against concrete. Jonathan slowed, his hand tightening instinctively on Aegis's leash. The bundle wasn't a bundle at all. It was a child. The child's head lolled against the older girl's shoulder, hair falling across a face too pale to belong to the living, lips parted in shallow gasps. Jonathan's chest constricted. In an instant, he was no longer in Greyhaven. He was back in that rural hospital, fluorescent light bleeding across linoleum, Emily's hand sweating in his own. The waiting room clock had ticked louder and louder until it drowned out his thoughts, and still no one had come. Not again. God, not again. The older girl shifted her weight beneath the sick child and stumbled forward, the effort dragging her face into view. Hazel eyes, wide with exhaustion, but fierce with something deeper. A determination far too old for 8 years. Her breath fogged in quick bursts. The tremor in her knees warned she wouldn't last much longer. Jonathan stepped forward before he even realized he was moving. His long coat whispered against the pavement. "Hey," he called softly, his voice steady but low, careful not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The girl froze beneath the streetlight. For a heartbeat, fear flickered across her features, raw and wild. She clutched the child on her back tighter, as though expecting the stranger in the fog to take rather than help. Aegis, sensing the wall between them, lowered his head. His tail swayed in a slow, measured rhythm. He padded forward, steps deliberate, ears forward, but relaxed. He stopped a few feet away, amber eyes steady on the girl, not demanding, only offering. His chest rose and fell in calm measure, each breath a silent reassurance. "I see you. I won't hurt you." The girl's grip on her sister eased just slightly. Her eyes darted to the dog, then back to Jonathan. "She's sick," she whispered, her voice raw, nearly lost to the wind. "She can't breathe right." Jonathan nodded, his throat thick. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to the girl's height, making his frame less imposing. "I can see that," he said gently. "You've been carrying her a long way." The girl pressed her lips together, as if the simple recognition might shatter her composure. She nodded once, then shifted her sister higher, her thin arms trembling with the effort. Jonathan's eyes traced the smaller child's shallow chest, the faint tremor in her hands, the way her head leaned too heavily. He didn't need medical charts to know how dire it was. His heart pounded with an old, bitter rhythm, one he thought he had buried with Emily. But here it was again, insistent. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked quietly. The girl hesitated, studying his face as if measuring whether it was safe to give him anything. Finally, she said, "Mira. And your sister?" "Elsa." The name cracked in her throat, carrying the weight of both fear and love. Jonathan glanced once more at Aegis. The shepherd stepped closer, slow and patient, until he stood near Mira's boots. He lifted his head, brushing his nose gently against the frayed hem of her coat. For the first time, Mira's eyes softened. She looked down at the dog, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his fur. Aegis leaned into the touch with quiet certainty, as if sealing an unspoken pact. Jonathan exhaled, the decision already made in the silence between breaths. "Mira," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "I have a car. I can get you both to the hospital right now. It's warm." "Safe. Let me help." She hesitated, eyes darting to the fog behind him, to the road ahead, to Elsa's pale face pressed against her shoulder. Trust had cost her too much already. Yet when she looked at Aegis, steady, waiting, his eyes a steady flame in the cold, her fear eased, if only by a fraction. Mira nodded. Jonathan straightened, careful not to move too quickly. "This way," he said. He guided them toward where his SUV waited, its dark frame parked along the curb like a refuge in the storm. As they walked, Mira's steps faltered, her body trembling from the effort of carrying Elsa. Jonathan reached out, but she shook her head sharply, her chin lifting with stubborn defiance. "I've got her," she said. "I know you do," Jonathan replied softly, "but you don't have to alone anymore." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of waves breaking in the distance and the quiet scuff of Aegis's paws. Jonathan stole a glance at Mira's face, pale, determined, far older than it should be. In her eyes he saw not just exhaustion, but the same fierce will Emily had carried when she used to argue for a puppy, for staying up past bedtime, for another story. It struck him so hard, his chest ached. As they reached the SUV, Aegis leapt gracefully into the back seat, curling along the far side as if already making room. Mira climbed in slowly, settling Elsa against her lap, her arms curling protectively around her sister. Jonathan closed the door carefully, then rested his hand for a moment on the cold metal, steadying himself against the wave of memory. The flickering streetlight above them buzzed once more, casting their silhouettes in uneven light. The tall man, the fragile girls, the watchful dog. For Jonathan, it felt like the universe had pressed pause, leaving him with one truth clear enough to pierce through years of silence. This was no chance crossing. This was a second chance. The black SUV sat under the sagging streetlight like a waiting ship, its paint glistening with a sheen of sea mist. Jonathan pulled the handle, the door opening with a muted click, the warm interior light spilling into the fog. Mira lingered on the curb, her arms locked protectively around Elsa, her hazel eyes narrowed in suspicion. She had been turned away from too many doors to trust one that opened too easily. "You'll be warm inside," Jonathan said quietly, keeping his voice low, as though speaking to a skittish animal. He gestured to the back seat. "She needs heat. She needs it now." Mira swallowed, her gaze darting to Elsa's still form, then back to Jonathan. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't decide if words would betray her. In the silence, Aegis stepped closer, tail swaying in a slow arc. The shepherd hopped gracefully into the back seat, settling into the far corner, his head lifted toward Mira, as though inviting her in. His presence tipped the balance. With a shaky breath, Mira nodded once. She climbed into the SUV, pulling Elsa close against her chest. The blanket slipped, and Jonathan gently reached to adjust it over the sick child's shoulders. Mira flinched at first, then froze, watching him with wide eyes. He pulled his hand back slowly, a man remembering that trust was not given but earned. "You're safe now," he said softly, before closing the door. Inside, the air was warmer, tinged with the faint smell of leather and cedar oil. The hum of the heater kicked to life as Jonathan turned the ignition, headlights cutting through the mist ahead. Mira pressed her cheek against Elsa's damp forehead, rocking her gently, whispering words too low for Jonathan to hear. Aegis curled on the seat beside them, his flank pressed against Mira's side, his breath steady and reassuring. Elsa's small fingers twitched, clutching at the dog's fur even in unconsciousness, as though she knew she was no longer alone. Jonathan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The image of the two girls in his back seat blurred for a moment with memory. Another girl, his girl, her head slumped against his shoulder as he carried her into a hospital lobby years ago. He had pleaded with doctors then too, begged for urgency, demanded care. And still, he had stood in a sterile hallway with a clock ticking mercilessly while life slipped away behind a door that never opened fast enough. Emily. Her name pressed against the inside of his chest like broken glass. He blinked hard, forcing his eyes back to the road, the present. This was not then. This was now, and this time he would not let a child die waiting. The SUV rolled through Greyhaven's quiet streets, the town hushed as though holding its breath. Shops stood shuttered, their signs swaying faintly in the breeze. Holiday garlands, limp and forgotten, drooped across empty windows. The world had closed itself in against the cold, leaving only this small convoy, a man, 2 children, and a dog, moving against the silence. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Each passing block scraped another layer of old grief raw. But beneath the ache, there was something else stirring. Purpose. A reason to drive faster than memory. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Mira sat rigid, her arms wrapped tightly around Elsa, eyes fixed on her sister's face as if sheer will could hold her there. Her lips moved, whispering a mantra only Elsa could hear. Jonathan recognized the look. It was the same one he had worn when he refused to leave Emily's bedside. A kind of desperate faith that love alone could anchor a soul to earth. "You're strong," Jonathan said quietly, almost to himself. But Mira's eyes lifted to meet his in the mirror. He held her gaze for a moment, before looking back at the road. Most people wouldn't have made it this far carrying her. Mira didn't answer, but her chin lifted just slightly, the faintest acknowledgement that she'd heard him. Aegis stirred, shifting closer to the girls. He stretched his long body across the seat, placing his head gently on Mira's knee. Mira's hand moved instinctively to his fur, her fingers tangling in the thick sable coat. For the first time that night, her face softened, just a fraction, as if the warmth beneath her palm reminded her she wasn't carrying the burden alone anymore. Jonathan drove on, the fog curling in the beams of the headlights, the road unspooling before them like a fragile thread. The silence inside the SUV was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with breathing, with memory, with unspoken promises. He thought again of Emily's last night, how he had stood helpless while minutes stacked into hours, each tick of the clock a nail in the coffin of his hope. How her small hand had gripped his, her lips moving without sound, and how he had whispered back, hold on, as though saying it enough could change the laws of time. He had failed then. But tonight, as he pressed harder on the gas, He felt a vow shaping itself in his chest. He would not fail these children, not while breath remained in him. As they crossed into the brighter streets near Seaside Medical Center, the faint glow of the hospital sign appeared in the distance, cutting through the fog like a beacon. Jonathan's grip tightened on the wheel. In the back seat, Mira's eyes locked onto the sign too, the smallest flicker of relief passing across her face. Aegis lifted his head, ears pricking, as if sensing the shift in the air. His tail thumped once against the seat, then settled. Elsa stirred faintly, her breath shallow but still there. Jonathan whispered under his breath, though no one could hear. "Not this time." The SUV carried them forward, headlights slicing through the mist, toward the one place left that might still open its doors. And inside, for the first time in years, Jonathan felt that the past was not just a weight dragging him down. It was a fire, pushing him forward. The automatic doors of Seaside Medical Center slid open, with a mechanical sigh, spilling fluorescent light into the damp night. Jonathan pulled the SUV into the emergency bay, headlights bouncing off polished glass and rain-dark asphalt. For a heartbeat, he sat still behind the wheel, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, chest tightening with memories of another hospital entrance, another desperate drive. Then he killed the engine and stepped out. The cold bit instantly, but he didn't feel it. His focus was on the back seat where Mira clutched Elsa against her chest, the girl's small body limp beneath the blanket. Aegis had pressed himself close, his head resting protectively near Elsa's shoulder, eyes fixed on her face as if measuring every fragile breath. Jonathan opened the back door. "We're here," he said gently, his voice steady for Mira's sake. "Let me help." She shook her head stubbornly, clutching Elsa tighter, unwilling to release her sister even to the man who had brought them this far. Jonathan didn't argue. He simply stepped aside, holding the door open as Mira slid out, her arms trembling with the weight of both her sister and her own fear. Inside the sliding doors, the reception desk sat under the harsh glare of hospital lights. Behind it, a pair of nurses hunched over computer screens, their voices low, the kind of tired chatter that comes from too many shifts and too little hope. One of them glanced up at the approaching figures, her eyes lingering on Mira's worn coat, Elsa's threadbare blanket, and the sight of a dog trotting loyally at their side. Her expression hardened, not with cruelty, but with the kind of weary dismissal born from too many nameless cases. "Those kids again," she muttered under her breath to her colleague, not quietly enough. "No paperwork, no parents, always the same story." Jonathan heard it. His jaw tightened, but he kept moving. He had dealt with gatekeepers before, men and women who measured worth by documents and signatures. Tonight, he would not let them measure these children into invisibility. At the triage desk, Nurse Claire Donovan looked up from a stack of intake forms. In her late 30s, she carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who had weathered too many storms in too few years. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a neat braid, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. Beneath the practiced professionalism in her hazel eyes lay something else, weariness, not of the work itself, but of the system that too often failed the very people she had sworn to protect. And she had seen too many children slip through the cracks, lost between policies and paperwork, dismissed as burdens instead of lives worth saving. When her gaze landed on Mira, red-cheeked, trembling, clutching her unconscious sister, Claire's posture changed. The weariness did not disappear, but it made room for urgency. She rose from her chair, clipboard in hand. "What's her name?" Claire asked, stepping forward. Mira's voice was barely a whisper. "Elsa." "How long has she been like this?" "Hours." Mira's voice cracked. She couldn't breathe. They wouldn't help us at the clinic. Her eyes darted down, as though ashamed to even admit it. Claire's jaw tightened. She had heard enough about Dr. Pike to know exactly what had happened. But she kept her focus where it belonged. She reached out, gently brushing the back of her fingers against Elsa's forehead. The heat there made her heart lurch. She's febrile. Let's get her inside now. Claire's voice cut through the sterile air, brisk and commanding. One of the desk nurses called out, "Claire, you'll need clearance. No guardian, no insurance on file." Jonathan stepped forward before Claire could answer. His presence filled the space like a sudden shift in weather. He was tall, his charcoal coat still damp from the mist, his silver hair catching the overhead light. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight behind it silenced the room. "Clearance?" Jonathan's eyes locked on the nurse. "This child doesn't need clearance. She needs oxygen." The nurse faltered, lowering her gaze back to the screen. Jonathan's tone softened, but the steel remained. "Do whatever paperwork you want later. Tonight, you'll treat her as if she were your own." Something in his voice, something that carried the weight of boardrooms and broken hearts, left no room for objection. The nurse didn't argue again. Claire met Jonathan's eyes, and in that brief exchange, an understanding passed between them. He was not a man who took no for an answer, and she was not a nurse who would let a child die on her watch. "This way," Claire said, motioning toward the corridor. Mira followed close, her arms aching, her breath uneven. Jonathan walked alongside her, steadying her steps without touching, giving her space to carry her sister with dignity. Aegis padded silently at Mira's heel, nails clicking faintly against the tile. More than one staff member glanced nervously at the dog, but none dared speak when Jonathan's hand rested casually on the leash, his presence daring anyone to try. As they passed the waiting area, a man in scrubs muttered, "Another charity case. Always the same." Claire snapped her head toward him. "That's enough, Brian." Her voice cut like glass. "If you don't have the stomach for this, transfer out of emergency." The man looked away, chastened. Jonathan's gaze lingered on Claire with something close to gratitude. He recognized fire when he saw it. They reached an exam bay, the curtain already pulled back. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm plastic. Machines hummed, waiting. Claire gestured to the bed. "Lay her here." Mira hesitated. Her arms tightened around Elsa, as though the bed itself might steal her sister away. "It's all right," Claire said gently, crouching slightly so her eyes met Mira's. "You can stay right beside her. I won't let her out of your sight." Mira searched her face, then slowly, reluctantly, lowered Elsa onto the bed. The child's head lolled, a faint wheeze escaping her lips. Mira's hand clung to Elsa's sleeve, even as Claire moved quickly to attach a pulse oximeter to the small finger. The numbers on the screen made Claire's brows knit. "Let's get oxygen in her now," she called, her tone sharp with urgency. As another nurse hurried to bring the mask, Mira pressed closer to the bed rail, her wide eyes fixed on her sister's shallow chest. Jonathan stood at the foot of the bed, his jaw set, his hands clenched into fists in the pockets of his coat. Aegis settled beside Mira's chair, lying down, but keeping his eyes locked on Elsa, a sentinel in fur and muscle. For a moment, time narrowed to the sound of Elsa's labored breaths, the hiss of oxygen flowing, and the low hum of machines. It was fragile, precarious, but it was also hope. Jonathan exhaled, his chest tight. He had walked into this building bracing for another door to be slammed shut, for history to repeat itself. But Claire Donovan had opened it wide, and in that threshold, something shifted. The double doors burst open with a hydraulic hiss, spilling harsh white light into the corridor. Nurses in pale scrubs wheeled the gurney inside, the wheels squealing against linoleum. Elsa's tiny frame looked even smaller against the vast stretcher, swallowed up in hospital sheets. Her chest barely lifted, her lips tinged the faint blue of someone slipping away from the world's warmth. Nurse Claire Donovan was the first to act, her voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of fear that only seasoned professionals could disguise. "Oxygen mask. Now, let's get a line in. Monitor on vitals." A mask descended over Elsa's face, fogging with shallow breaths. The beeping of machines filled the air like a metronome of mortality. Too fast, too fragile. Mira stood pressed against the bed rail, her knuckles pale, her throat raw from hours of holding back panic. She tried to whisper reassurance, but her voice cracked. "I'm here, Elsa. Don't be scared. I'm right here." Her words trembled in the sterile air, as though they could be snatched away by the noise of the machines. Every instinct screamed for her to climb onto the bed, to hold her sister as she had on cold nights in abandoned corners. But here she was told to step back. She refused, her body anchored against the rail, as if by sheer presence she could tether Elsa to life. Aegis padded in silently, his claws clicking against the tile. No one tried to stop him. The German shepherd moved with a gravity that silenced hesitation. He stationed himself at the foot of the bed, folding into a sphinx-like stillness. His amber eyes tracked every twitch of Elsa's chest beneath the oxygen mask. To Mira, it felt like more than a guard. It was as if the dog carried part of the burden she could no longer hold. Jonathan stood behind them, shoulders squared, his face unreadable in the fluorescent glare. He had seen rooms like this before, saw his daughter fade beneath similar lights, and the memory gouged him raw. But tonight, something shifted. Where once he had stood powerless, tonight he stood as anchor, making certain these children would not be dismissed, not be allowed to vanish beneath red tape. His presence filled the space, silent yet commanding. Claire adjusted the oxygen flow, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She's hypoxic. Oxygen saturation climbing but slowly. I need a blood panel, and someone page pediatrics." A younger nurse muttered under her breath, not quite softly enough. "Another Jane Doe. Why is it always us getting stuck with these?" Mira's head snapped toward her, eyes wide and burning. Shame flitted across the nurse's face, but she did not retract the words. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice like granite. "They are not nameless. This one is Elsa." He pointed toward the bed. His voice dropped, but held the force of a verdict. "And she deserves every ounce of care you would give a child with a golden insurance card. Do you understand me?" The room froze. The hum of machines filled the silence left in his wake. The young nurse looked away, chastened. Claire glanced at him, something like gratitude flashing in her eyes, before she returned to adjusting the monitors. Mira's knees threatened to give way, but she gripped the rail tighter. Every beep of the machine became a lifeline she counted in her head. Her heart pounded in rhythm with Elsa's faint pulse. The edges of her world blurred, but she forced her focus to stay sharp, terrified that if she blinked too long, Elsa might slip further away. Aegis stirred. The dog lowered his head, resting his muzzle across Mira's shoes. The pressure was grounding, steady. She looked down, met his amber gaze, and for a fleeting moment felt that she was not alone in this unbearable vigil. "Vitals stabilizing," Claire announced after a tense stretch of minutes. "She's holding, for now." The relief in her tone was muted, fragile, but Mira seized on it as though it were a rope, pulling her out of quicksand. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his chest loosening a fraction. He looked at Mira, at the way she pressed herself against the bed rail, like she could fuse into it, like she would rather be torn apart than let go. Something old and broken inside him recognized the mirror of his own past desperation. Claire placed a gentle hand on Mira's shoulder, her voice soft now. "You can stay with her, but you need to let us work around you. I promise. I won't let her out of my sight." Mira nodded, too choked to answer. The machines beeped on. The storm outside battered against glass windows in rhythmic gusts, as though the night itself was raging against the fragility within these walls. Yet in that sterile emergency bay, against all odds, there was still breath in Elsa's chest. Still the faint fog of oxygen on the mask. Still Mira's trembling hand holding the bed rail and Aegis's watchful eyes refusing to close. For the first time that night, hope slipped its way into the room, not bold, not loud, but quiet and stubborn, like a candle refusing to die in a storm. The hum of machines filled the room with an odd rhythm, steady, mechanical, impersonal. Yet, in that sterile emergency bay, something deeply human was unfolding. Mira sat on the plastic chair by Elsa's bedside, her small hands gripping the bed rail as if the thin metal were the only anchor keeping her from being swept away. The oxygen mask fogged lightly with each breath Elsa managed, her chest rising in fragile intervals. Jonathan stood a few feet away, broad shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room as if the walls themselves might try to harm the children. Aegis lay curled near Mira's boots, a dark shadow of vigilance, his amber eyes flickering toward every sound that broke the monotony. The squeak of a shoe sole in the hall, the shuffle of papers at the nurse's station. For long moments, silence hung between them, heavy and unspoken. It was Mira who finally broke it, not with words, but with a glance. Her eyes, hollow from too many nights of fear, lifted and caught Jonathan's. "Why are you helping us?" she asked softly, voice brittle, more suspicion than gratitude. Jonathan's throat tightened. He hadn't expected her to speak so directly. His instinct was to retreat into silence, the shield he had carried for years. But something in her eyes, a rawness that reminded him of another child's eyes once upon a time, forced the words from him. "Because I've been where you are," he said, his voice rough, low. "Because once someone should have helped my little girl, and no one did." Mira blinked, processing the confession. There was no melodrama in his tone, no attempt to make her pity him. Just a flat truth, the kind that bore its own weight. Claire Donovan, who had been adjusting Elsa's IV line, glanced back at them. She noticed the way Jonathan's stance shifted, slightly forward, angled like a shield between the children and the world beyond the curtain. Protective, instinctive. It wasn't just duty, she realized. It was grief, reshaped into guardianship. Mira's small hands clenched the rail tighter. She's all I have left," she whispered, eyes darting to her sister. Jonathan's jaw worked, and for a moment he couldn't answer. His gaze softened, though, and Mira could see the storm of memory behind his eyes. Nights of waiting. The moment loss had carved its mark on him, the helplessness he had never outrun. "I know," he said simply. "That's why we'll fight for her, together." The word hung there. Together. Mira looked down quickly, as if afraid to believe in it, afraid to hand her trust to someone who could disappear like all the others. But Aegis shifted then, resting his heavy head against her foot. She flinched at the warmth, at the silent pledge in the dog's presence. Elsa's chest rose again, slightly stronger this time, less shallow. The monitor beeped with a steadier rhythm. Mira leaned forward, almost pressing her forehead to the rail. "She's breathing better," Claire said softly, allowing a rare note of encouragement to enter her voice. She knew not to give false hope, but this she could say with certainty. Mira's eyes brimmed with something dangerously close to relief. Her lips trembled, caught between prayer and sob. Jonathan watched her, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir where grief had built walls. A fragile hope, fragile enough to shatter at a whisper, yet alive. He exhaled slowly, letting his rigid stance ease just enough that Claire noticed. She paused at the foot of the bed, studying the man who had barged into her ward with a presence that forced others to act. Now, she saw not only command, but also fracture, the kind that only loss could carve into someone's bones. Mira looked at him again, her voice barely audible. "Do you really think she'll be okay?" Jonathan's eyes flicked to Elsa, then back to Mira. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched so he was eye level with her, not towering above like every other adult who had dismissed her fears. "I can't promise the world," he said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of someone who had once made promises he couldn't keep. "But I can promise you this. She's not alone anymore. Neither are you." For the first time, Mira didn't look away. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, as though testing the weight of his words against every betrayal she had known. And something, tiny, almost imperceptible, shifted in her. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in the armor of mistrust she had been forced to wear. Elsa's chest rose again, stronger still. The oxygen mask fogged with steadier rhythm. Claire gave a small nod. "There," she said gently. "She's fighting back." Mira let out a shaky breath, one hand reaching through the rail to touch Elsa's blanket-covered arm. Aegis lifted his head, ears flicking, then laid it back down as if confirming to himself that his watch could continue in quiet for now. Jonathan remained crouched, watching the two sisters. In their fragile bond, in the rise and fall of a child's breath, he saw not only what he had lost, but also what might still be saved. And though he knew the fight ahead would be long, in that moment, he allowed himself the smallest luxury: hope, borrowed from the resilience of children. The hum of machines continued, steady, unrelenting. But for the first time, it didn't feel cold. It felt like a heartbeat, one that echoed in all of them, binding them together in silence, in grief, in fragile, undeniable hope. The fluorescent lights in the records room buzzed with that faint, tired hum that hospitals never seem to fix. It was the kind of sound you stopped hearing after a while, but Claire Donovan couldn't tune it out tonight. She was running on half an hour of sleep, her scrubs still carrying the faint chemical scent of antiseptic, and yet her mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. Something about those two children, Mira with her guarded stare, Elsa with her frail breaths tethered to machines, refused to let her rest. She slid the manila file across the counter, fingers brushing the frayed edge. The label, written in the looping script of an intake nurse, was already smudged. Elsa, Mira, Doe. Another nameless pair. Another entry in the endless catalogue of forgotten children who showed up with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Claire opened it carefully, expecting at least the bare minimum: birth dates, addresses, fragments of school records, maybe even a police report. But what met her eyes was almost worse than nothing. A handful of typed pages, medical observations scribbled in margins. And then, scattered between them, yawning absences where there should have been more. The intake address listed a building on Dockside Lane, but beside it, in red ink, lease terminated, occupants unknown. No forwarding contact, no signatures, no follow-up notes from social services. Her stomach tightened. Claire had seen bad record-keeping before. She had fought for kids who fell through cracks wider than any safety net was built to catch. But this felt deliberate. Whole sections of their file seemed to have been removed, as if someone had decided that these children didn't warrant a paper trail at all. She turned the page. An immunization record half completed. A foster care referral form, unsigned. She flipped again. Blank. A stapled section where pages had been neatly torn out, leaving only the ragged perforation. Dockside Lane. Terminated lease. No occupants. The words glared back at her. She knew the area too well. Derelict buildings by the harbor. Warehouses converted into half-promises of affordable housing before collapsing back into vacancies. The kind of address that always looked official on paper, but in reality was nothing more than an empty shell with boarded windows. Claire exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the cheap plastic folder sleeve. Vanished through the cracks, she murmured. The phrase wasn't metaphorical anymore. It was literal. Behind her, the records clerk shuffled papers, oblivious. He didn't look up, didn't care. This wasn't his fight. But for Claire, the thought of those girls, sleeping under roofs that never existed, shuffled like forgotten parcels through a system that barely pretended to notice, gnawed at her chest like hunger. Her mind replayed the intake moment earlier in the night, the dismissive sigh from another nurse. 2 nameless kids again. And the way Jonathan, that towering stranger with military shoulders and haunted eyes, had bristled in silence. He had forced open the hospital doors with nothing but his presence, demanding care for children who weren't his. And for one fragile second, the system had yielded. But now the system was reasserting itself. Cold, bureaucratic, faceless. It left her with a file that told her everything and nothing all at once. She pressed her palm against the folder as if willing answers to appear. Nothing came. Only the quiet thrum of fluorescent lights, the faint hiss of an air vent, the hollow ache of her own weariness. She thought of Elsa, chest finally rising a little stronger beneath the oxygen mask. She thought of Mira, eyes like flint, clutching that German shepherd's fur, as if Aegis were the last living anchor she had left. Children don't vanish on their own, Claire knew. Someone erases them. Claire closed the file slowly, her hand trembling. For a moment she allowed herself to lean back in the chair, staring at the ceiling tiles yellowed with age. She had sworn, years ago, that she wouldn't let herself drown in outrage anymore. Anger alone never changed a system. But looking at this, she felt the heat rise anyway. Jonathan had asked no questions yet. He had carried the girls in with the unspoken weight of someone who understood how fragile life was, who had lived through losses that could never be written into any file. He hadn't asked who failed them. He had only demanded that they be seen, treated and saved. Claire, however, couldn't stop asking. What parent had once signed a lease at Dockside Lane? Why had the pages been torn? Who had decided these children didn't deserve a paper trail? a trace of existence. Her eyes returned to the red ink. Lease terminated. The word terminated dug into her. Final. Cold. Like the closing of a case file, the end of a sentence. But she knew better. Nothing was over. Not for those girls, not for Jonathan, and not for her. Somewhere between the sterile hallways and the bureaucratic red tape, 2 lives had been erased. And if she didn't push back, if she didn't start asking questions, others refused to ask. They would be erased again, even as they were lying in rooms just down the hall, breathing shallow but alive. Claire slid the file into her bag, ignoring protocol. Her badge might not give her the authority to rewrite the system, but she still had her eyes, her voice, and the stubborn weight of her own conscience. She would not let them vanish. As she stepped out of the records room, the corridor stretched before her in pale linoleum, leading back toward the emergency bay where Elsa and Mira lay. The hum of machines reached faintly even here, and with it came a thought she couldn't shake. This was bigger than 2 children. This was a shadow cast long before they walked through her hospital doors, and shadows always meant something was being hidden. The hallway outside Elsa's room had emptied into a hush that belonged more to a chapel than a hospital wing. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, their sterile glow reflecting against the glass panels. Jonathan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly, his stance betraying a restlessness that had nothing to do with fatigue. He had fought wars, stood before men who wanted him dead, and yet this, 2 children adrift in a system that pretended not to see, was a battlefield he hadn't trained for. Claire had left moments earlier, chart in hand, her expression shadowed by frustration after combing through incomplete files. Jonathan had caught the flash of defeat in her eyes, the look of someone who had seen too many children lost in paperwork instead of rescued in time. He couldn't let it end there. Pulling a small, battered phone from his jacket pocket, Jonathan scrolled through the sparse contacts. Most were long gone, numbers disconnected, voices he no longer had the right to call, but one name still pulsed like an ember: Rachel Bloom. He exhaled, pressed the button, and lifted the phone to his ear. The ringtone stretched, cold and impersonal, until it clicked, and a voice, calm, clear, and edged with a lawyer's practiced control, answered. Rachel Bloom. Rachel, it's Jonathan Hale. His voice was low, almost a growl from deep in his chest. There was a pause, then a sharper intake of breath. Jonathan? After all these years, my God, I thought— No time. He cut her off, his tone firm but not unkind. I'm standing in Seaside Medical. 2 kids, no names that stick. No records that lead anywhere. Files with addresses that don't exist. Dockside Lane. Lease terminated 2 years ago. They've been abandoned, Rachel. And no one's moving. The line went quiet, and for a heartbeat Jonathan could hear only the faint murmur of nurses down the hall. Then Rachel's voice came, quieter now, tinged with both recognition and the kind of moral fury Jonathan remembered. You sound the same. Different war, but the same voice. Tell me everything. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward the room where Elsa lay. Through the small glass panel, he saw Mira sitting upright in the chair, her small hand pressed to her sister's blanket. Aegis, ever still, curled at their feet like carved stone. He turned back, lowering his voice, though every word landed with the weight of a hammer. 2 girls, one barely breathing when I carried her in. The other won't leave her side. There's no mother, no father, no guardian stepping in. The hospital records are a maze of vanished addresses and pending case numbers. You know what that means? They've slipped through the cracks because somebody let them, or pushed them. Rachel sighed, a sound more like steel tightening than air releasing. And you think it's systemic? I don't think so, Rachel. I know. I've seen the look in the staff's eyes. They've seen this before. They're tired, jaded. But children don't vanish on their own. Someone signed off. Someone buried the trail. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that neglect leaves fingerprints. Find them. The silence on the other end lingered, but Jonathan knew her. He could picture Rachel pacing in her office, already dragging legal pads closer, already calculating the fight. When she spoke again, her voice carried that old fire he'd trusted once in another lifetime. Give me what you have. Names, if they have them. Addresses, case notes, even if incomplete. I'll start there. I'll run to Dockside Lane. I'll dig through property records, social service logs, every intake form I can subpoena. Jonathan, if these children failed, I'll find out how, and I'll make them answer for it. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. Relief didn't come easily to him, but for the first time since carrying Elsa into the ER, he felt the ground solidify beneath his feet. Mira and Elsa, he said. That's what they answered. Nothing else. Start with that. And Rachel. His tone softened, almost imperceptibly. Don't let them bury this. I won't, she promised. You have my word. The call ended, but the echo of her conviction lingered in the sterile corridor. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his jacket, straightened, and walked toward the window of Elsa's room once more. Claire emerged from inside, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. You made a call, she said quietly, more a statement than a question. Jonathan met her gaze evenly. I called someone who doesn't look away, someone who'll make sure these kids aren't just two more names lost on paper. There was something in the way Claire held his stare, a recognition that whatever Jonathan Hale had been before, soldier or wanderer, he had just drawn a line in the sand. Inside the room, Elsa's chest rose faintly beneath the sheets, steadier now, as Mira whispered something to Aegis, and the dog's ears twitched in acknowledgement. The fragile thread of life was holding. Jonathan watched them a moment longer, then whispered words not meant for anyone else's ears. Not on my watch. And for the first time, the war inside him felt like it had a purpose again. The sky was washed in an amber-grey haze when Jonathan steered the sedan down toward Dockside Lane. The sun hadn't quite set, but the light carried that half-spent heaviness of day, giving way to evening. Mira sat in the back seat, her small hands clutched around the worn strap of a canvas bag she had insisted on bringing. She stared out the window, the glass fogged by her breath, her reflection pale and far older than her years. Aegis shifted beside her, a steady presence filling the silence with the soft thrum of his breathing. His ears twitched at every passing sound. An old bicycle clattering against a fence, a gull's cry carried in from the harbor. He seemed to sense what Jonathan hadn't spoken aloud. This wasn't just a simple retrieval of belongings. This was a return to a place where something had broken. The road narrowed as they approached the row of weathered townhouses that clung to Dockside Lane like tired sentries. Paint peeled from their facades, shutters hung crooked, and weeds pushed up through cracks in the pavement. Jonathan slowed, scanning until Mira lifted a trembling finger and pointed. There, she whispered. The house looked abandoned, the kind of place people passed by without ever looking twice. Its windows were smeared with grime, blinds crooked in the frames. Jonathan parked a few feet away, switched off the engine, and let the silence settle. He turned to Mira. Are you sure you're ready? He asked. Her chin wobbled, but she nodded, determination sharpening the edge of her fear. Aegis pressed his muzzle against her knee as if urging her forward. Jonathan exhaled, then stepped out into the cooling air. The three of them approached the front steps together, Mira's footsteps hesitant on the cracked concrete. Aegis walked slightly ahead, his tail stiff, his entire frame taut with a soldier's awareness. Jonathan reached for the doorknob, but Aegis stopped short. His body angled, ears flat, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Jonathan froze. His eyes darted to where Aegis's gaze had locked, the front door. At first he saw nothing, but then the detail emerged under the dimming light. Fresh gouges ran along the wood near the lock, ragged scratches too sharp, too deliberate to be from weather. Someone had tried to force their way inside. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He crouched, brushing his fingers over the grooves. Splinters caught beneath his skin. "This wasn't here before," he murmured. Mira's face paled. She edged closer to Aegis, whose growl deepened, vibrating like a warning bell through the air. The dog's stance was unmistakable. Alert, defensive, ready. Jonathan straightened slowly, every instinct sharpening. "Stay close to Aegis," he told Mira, his voice low. She nodded, pressing her shoulder against the shepherd's flank. Jonathan eased the door open. It groaned on rusted hinges, the sound cutting the silence like a blade. Dust carried on the stale air, but beneath it lingered something sharper, almost metallic. Jonathan scanned the shadows as they stepped inside. The apartment looked even smaller than he remembered from the file notes. Bare walls, threadbare carpet, and a scattering of objects left as if someone had departed in a rush. A cracked mug on the counter, a blanket slumped on the floor. Mira's eyes searched the space, catching on little pieces that belonged to her world. Her shoes tucked by the wall, the ragged stuffed rabbit that lay face down near the couch. She darted forward and scooped it up, clutching it so tightly the seams strained. Jonathan remained at the threshold, listening. He didn't like the silence. It was too complete, like a held breath waiting for release. Aegis padded forward cautiously, nose sweeping the air, pausing near the doorframe. His body stiffened again. He glanced back at Jonathan, a silent signal between them. Jonathan's gaze followed the shepherd's stance to the back window. The latch hung broken, the glass smudged by what looked like a fresh handprint. Someone had been here, and recently. "Jonathan!" Mira's voice was a whisper. She stood near the couch, rabbit clutched to her chest. "Someone was in here." His throat tightened. "I know." For a moment, the weight of it pressed down. The realization that whoever had once failed these girls wasn't content to simply let them vanish. Someone was still circling, still watching. Jonathan moved carefully, checking each corner, each doorway. Nothing stirred. Yet he couldn't shake the sense of being observed, as though eyes lingered from beyond the thin walls. He paused at the broken window, running his hand over the latch, his jaw set. "Why would anyone come back here?" he muttered under his breath. Mira's answer was quiet, almost lost in the stillness. "Because of us." Jonathan turned to her, his chest tightening at the certainty in her voice. She wasn't guessing. She knew. A child's instinct sharpened by too many nights of fear. Aegis shifted closer to Mira, placing himself squarely between her and the window. His presence was a wall of muscle and instinct, a silent promise that nothing would touch her again without going through him. Jonathan studied the scratches on the door one more time, the broken latch, the smudges. Whoever had come here hadn't just been curious. They had been searching. For what? He didn't yet know. But one thing was clear. Mira and Elsa hadn't slipped through the cracks of a broken system by chance. Someone had pushed them there, someone who might still be watching. He walked back to Mira, crouched to meet her eyes. "We take what you need, and then we leave. Understand?" She nodded, clutching the rabbit tighter. Jonathan straightened, scanning the room once more. He felt it then, a prickle along the back of his neck, that old soldier's instinct whispering danger. Outside, somewhere beyond the thin walls, a shadow moved, not close enough to see, but close enough to know they weren't alone. He closed the door behind them when they finally stepped out, locking it even though the scratches mocked the gesture. Mira pressed against his side, Aegis close to her other. Together, they walked back toward the car, three figures bound by something larger than chance. And as Jonathan helped Mira into the seat, he caught it again, the faintest flicker at the far end of Dockside Lane. A silhouette, still as stone, watching. Jonathan met the gaze across the distance, his jaw tightening. Whoever it was melted back into the shadows a moment later, but the message was carved deep. They were not invisible. They were not forgotten. And someone did not want them found. The evening air in Dockside Lane clung heavy with salt and rust, the kind of damp that seeped into bricks and made lamps flicker like they were tired of standing watch. Claire pulled her coat tighter, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the row of weather-beaten houses. Curtains were drawn, shutters nailed, walls sagging like faces that had forgotten how to smile. This was a street where secrets grew like mold, and neighbors survived by looking away. She knocked on the first door, an older woman's place with paint peeling in strips. One sharp eye peered through the crack. "You're not from around here," the woman rasped, voice smoke rough. "Claire, investigative journalist. I'm trying to understand what happened to the children at number 12. The woman hesitated, fear cutting sharper than apathy. Then the chain slid free. Tobacco and damp laundry drifted out with her words. They were sweet girls, left alone too often. We'd hear them crying at night, pounding on the wall like they wanted someone, anyone to hear. That man, Carl Vance, supposed to be watching them. Claire's pen scratched. Carl Vance was their babysitter? The woman's lips thinned. More like a parasite. Yelled at them, left bruises. We called social services twice. Got silence back. You stopped trying after a while. This city forgets children faster than it forgets bills. Claire thanked her quietly and moved on. At the next porch, a young father smoked a cheap cigar, eyes wary. "You're digging into Vance," he said before she asked. "Careful. Some folks still owe him favors." "Favors?" Claire pressed. "Pills, debts. He'd watch kids, but only as leverage. I saw him grip one of those girls so hard she couldn't move. Police drove by plenty. Never stopped. He spat into the gutter. He vanished. But me, I think he's still watching." Cold coiled down Claire's spine. By the end of the street, she had a portrait painted in fragments. Carl Vance, a man who fed on neglect, who slid through cracks in a broken system like oil through water. She pictured Mira and Elsa curled together in the dark, crying while the world turned its back. Her throat tightened. On the page, she wrote deliberately, "Carl Vance, babysitter, dealer, violent." Children vanished. The courthouse annex smelled of paper dust and stale coffee. Rachel Bloom spread thin files across the counter, breath fogging in the winter draft. Reports were incomplete, signatures missing, names blacked out so heavily the paper nearly tore. Yet the name surfaced again and again, like oil, refusing to sink. Carl Vance. Deputy Mark Jensen appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, his eyes carrying the weight of things unsaid. He slid a folder across the table. "You're digging into Vance. Most people won't even say his name. But I pulled what I could. Booking photos, witness notes, scraps that never made it past hearings. The victims disappeared. Families erased." Rachel opened the folder. A mugshot stared back. Shaved head, smirk, like the arrest was an inconvenience. Even blurred, his eyes looked hollow. "These span a decade," Mark said. "Theft, assault, then suddenly nothing." Either he stopped being worth the paperwork, or someone wanted him off the radar. Rachel asked about victims. Mark's jaw tightened. A woman in 2009, beaten unconscious, filed, then retracted. Broken ribs don't come from overreacting. Teachers reported bruises on kids he dropped off. Next day, the family vanished from the rolls. Lease terminated. Forwarding address fake. We had chances, and everyone slipped. Rachel shut the file with a soft thud. He kept them moving, invisible. Mark nodded grimly. "And now, I've heard his name twice in a month. People whisper it like the walls might hear. He's back." Silence pressed thick between them. Rain tapped the courthouse windows like a metronome of urgency. Rachel thought of Jonathan, of Mira trembling in court, of Aegis growling at shadows. Abandonment wasn't the right word. These children had been erased. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Eyes that won't shut when politics press down," Mark replied. "Some in this precinct would rather keep the peace than stir this mess. And you? I've worn this badge for 15 years. The only thing worse than predators are systems that protect them. I won't let that happen again." Rachel gathered the files, their weight heavier than steel. "Then we move fast. If he's back, children are in danger." Mark exhaled, half relief, half dread. "I'll put words out discreetly. You keep pressing. We meet in the middle before he vanishes again." At the door, he added, "Counselor, be careful. Vance isn't just a name in a file. He knows how to move when no one's looking." Rachel gave a tight nod. Then it's time someone kept their eyes open. Dockside Lane held its breath. Houses pressed together like weary guards. Shutters closed against the cold. A streetlight sputtered, casting a broken halo across cracked pavement. That's when the sound came. Low, dragging, mechanical. An old pickup groaned down the lane, its rusted body blending into neglect around it. Carl Vance leaned forward at the wheel, knuckles bone white. The Ford wheezed with every turn, but to him, it was camouflage, a ghost among forgotten streets. He rolled the window down, breath clouding. "Where'd you put it, huh? Jewelry boxes don't just disappear." His voice rasped like rusted metal. His gaze fixed on number 14, the porch with wood split at the seams. That's where he'd left them. The girls. "They weren't supposed to scream," he muttered, lips cracked. "Told 'em to be good. Everything would have been fine." His words slid toward reverence, as if reciting a scripture only he believed. The truck idled in front of the house, headlights glaring across the doorframe. Fresh scratches marked the lock. Someone had already been here. His pulse jumped. "Loose ends," he growled. "Always loose ends." Tap, tap. tap. His finger drummed the dash, a rhythm carried since prison. You don't leave 'em hanging. You tie 'em off. From under a flannel shirt on the passenger seat, he lifted a crowbar streaked with rust, and beneath it a coil of rope. His fingers lingered as if drawing comfort. Find the box, shut their mouths, that's it, that's all. The jewelry box haunted him still. Cheap wood, chipped pink paint, lid that played a tinny lullaby. Inside weren't trinkets, but evidence of nights never meant to surface. The girls had clung to it, but if someone else had found it... His throat clenched. That could not happen. He killed the headlights. Darkness swallowed the lane, leaving only the dashboard glow reflecting his own hollow eyes. He studied himself, sneering at the glass. Think they forgot me? Think they're better off? His grin bent crooked. Don't worry, girls. Daddy Carl's home. The wind slapped at the truck, carrying the sharp tang of salt from the docks. A gull cried somewhere far off, its voice cracked and lonely. Carl didn't hear it. He was rehearsing how the crowbar would feel in his hand, how quickly he could silence what had been left behind. The truck clicked into park. His muttering dropped to a prayer. Find the box. Tie the ends. Make sure no one talks. Tap, tap, tap. The engine cut. Dockside Lane fell into silence. Too deep, too expectant. And within it, danger coiled. Not a storm yet, but the whisper of one waiting to break. The storm had settled into a whisper by the time Claire guided Mira and Elsa into Ethan's old timber house. The structure creaked with age, books sagging on dusty shelves, but the quiet inside felt protective, different from the silence of fear. Here, the air held a strange promise of safety. Mira settled on the rug, crayons scattered, sketching intently. Her drawing, a house, 2 girls, a tall figure, and a watchful dog. Aegis, the German shepherd, lay beside her, alert even in rest. But when Mira's hand found his back, he sighed and softened. On the couch, Elsa stirred. Her fever had broken. Her chest rose evenly now, color returning to her cheeks. Then, a smile, fragile, barely there, but real. Claire froze at the stove. Mira looked up. Aegis's tail gave a tentative thump. That smile was the first Elsa had shown since the night everything fell apart. Ethan stood in the doorway, half in shadow, the weight of old ghosts in his eyes. The hardened soldier seemed to crack slightly, something loosening in him. He hadn't spoken much, but when Elsa laughed, even faintly, he faltered. A hand gripped the frame like he needed to anchor himself. Claire saw the shift. So did Mira. She held up her drawing to Ethan. "This is us," she said. 4 figures, 2 girls, a man, a dog. Crude lines, but full of intent. Ethan took the paper gently, lingering on the image of the dog. His voice, low and scratchy, broke the silence. "You drew me too." Mira nodded. "Because you were there, not because he saved them. Just because he stayed." That was enough. Elsa's eyes fluttered open. "It feels safe," she whispered. Aegis rose, padded to her, and rested his head on her lap. Her hand found his fur. Her breathing calmed. Claire caught Ethan's gaze. No words, just knowing that something, trust, maybe, had started to return. The storm still knocked outside. But inside, the house was warming, slowly stitching itself together through silence, a child's drawing, and the quiet presence of a dog who refused to give up. The fire had dwindled to coals. Mira lay curled near the hearth, sketchpad hugged tight. Elsa dozed, her face calm, but Aegis stirred. His ears pricked. Something outside had shifted. He padded to the coat rack, pawing at Jonathan's old field jacket with sudden urgency. A low whine escaped him. Jonathan, half asleep, sat up. Aegis? But the dog didn't respond. He wasn't asking for a walk. He was signaling. Mira awoke too, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong with him?" she asked. Quiet. Jonathan stared at the dog's posture. Stiff. Focused. Not afraid, but ready. It was the same stance he'd seen before ambushes overseas. "He's trying to tell us something," he muttered. Mira nodded. "He wants you to listen." Jonathan rose, pulling the jacket off the hook. Aegis gave one sharp wag. Not joy. Confirmation. Mira gripped Jonathan's sleeve. "Don't leave us." He crouched to meet her eyes. "I won't. Not this time." As the door opened, night air rushed in, cold and metallic. Mira stood by the fire, watching him go. She trusted Aegis more than him, and somehow Jonathan understood why. Outside, the moon painted the yard in blue. Frost crunched beneath their feet. Aegis moved with precision, every sense alive. Jonathan didn't know what waited, only that Aegis never moved without reason. The phone felt like a brick in Jonathan's hand. He finally called Mark. "Ranger's acting strange," he said, his voice tight. "He won't leave the door. Keeps dragging me toward Dockside Lane." Mark didn't question it. "Dogs don't invent ghosts," he said. "I'll meet you there." Jonathan didn't wake the girls. They were finally safe, wrapped in a fragile cocoon of warmth. He grabbed his coat. Aegis pressed against him like an anchor. His amber eyes weren't frightened, just resolute. "Let's see what you're trying to tell me," Jonathan murmured. They drove into the night. Aegis braced against the dash, nose pressed to the glass. Every few minutes, a low, rumbling breath left him, like a warning. Dockside Lane appeared like a scar through the edge of town. Jonathan cut the headlights. The air smelled of brine and rust. Mark's SUV pulled up beside him. "Anything?" Jonathan shook his head. "Not yet. But he's locked in." The two men stepped out. Cold slapped their skin. The river whispered nearby. Then, a figure moved in the shadows. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "There," he whispered. Mark cursed. "That's Carl Vance's truck." Carl, hunched over a rental house door, worked a lock with shaking hands. His breath fogged the air. In his hands, a tool. On his lips, a whisper. "Tie it all up. No loose ends." Jonathan crouched low. Aegis pressed forward, silent and tense. Mark whispered, "He's after the jewelry box." "If he doesn't find it," Jonathan's voice was a thread, "he'll come after them." The lock gave a snap. Carl froze. His head tilted, like he sensed the breath of something just out of sight. Jonathan's hand slipped to Aegis's collar. The dog didn't move, but his whole body trembled with instinct. Jonathan whispered, "This ends tonight." And Dockside Lane, so long forgotten, held its breath. Dockside Lane was slick with drizzle, silence stretching like glass over the cracked pavement. Jonathan and Mark turned the corner, Aegis tense and growling, every inch of the shepherd coiled with warning. Under a broken street lamp, Carl hunched by a rental's door. A crowbar jammed into the lock, muttering to himself, "It has to be here." "Carl!" Jonathan's voice rang sharp. Carl spun, pale and panicked, a crowbar slipping from his grasp. "This isn't what it looks like," he gasped, backing away. Mark stepped forward, badge flashing. We caught you red-handed. It's over. But Carl lunged for the crowbar. Aegis barked, a feral sound that split the quiet. The leash stretched taut. Jonathan raised his voice, part command, part plea. "Stay down." Carl flinched. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone." But Aegis didn't believe him. His body remained locked, barking louder with each pulse of danger. Carl trembled, lips white with fear, sweat on his brow. "You don't get it. They'll kill me if I don't find it." Mark stiffened. That wasn't just paranoia. It was a crack in something bigger. Jonathan stepped in. "Then let us help. But this ends now." Aegis took one sharp step. Carl buckled. The crowbar clattered to the street. He dropped to his knees, hands on his head. Mark cuffed him fast, the click of metal final. Still, Aegis didn't move. Not until Jonathan pressed a hand to his shoulder. Only then did the shepherd exhale, a low pant, replacing his growl. Carl spat, voice broken. "You don't know what you're dealing with. They'll come for you too." Mark yanked him to his feet. "Save it for downtown." The rain thickened. Jonathan watched Carl, no longer a petty thief, but a crack in a wall they hadn't realized was rotting from within. Aegis nudged his palm. "Not over. Not yet." Mark searched Carl's coat, methodical. Carl sneered. "I got nothing." But Mark found more than nothing. First, a lighter, cheap, from a local hardware store, the kind given away with kerosene. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Next, a velvet jewelry box, worn and unmistakably stolen. A necklace shimmered faintly within. Mark's voice turned to steel. "This one matches the break-in reports, and this—" He held up a crowbar, scuffed, with red paint Jonathan recognized from the damaged doorframe earlier that night. Carl's smirk evaporated. Jonathan glanced toward the cruiser. Mira sat inside, small and silent, her hand white-knuckled on the door handle, her eyes locked on the jewelry box. She knew. Mark zipped the evidence into bags. "We've got enough to bury him. Theft, forced entry, and with that lighter, attempted arson." Jonathan said nothing. His gaze was still on Mira, on the child who hadn't spoken since the cuffs snapped, who had drawn fires in notebooks and flinched in her sleep. Now she saw what she'd feared made real, not imagined, named, stopped. Carl seethed. "Planted! You're all against me!" But no one listened, not anymore. As the patrol car took Carl away, Dockside Lane sank into a fragile hush. The adrenaline bled into silence, heavier than before. Jonathan stood by the cruiser, chest rising slow as if still bracing for something worse. Mira sat frozen in the back seat, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles blanched. Her eyes tracked Jonathan like he might disappear if she blinked. Aegis paced once, then settled beside her door. His ears low, his gaze steady. Not aggressive, reassuring. He whined, soft, offering comfort. Mira's grip loosened. Her fingers hovered, hesitant. Then, slowly, she touched Aegis's head. The shepherd leaned into it. Her shoulders dropped. Jonathan crouched beside the car. "You're safe now," he said, voice low. "He's not coming back. Not tonight. Not ever." She studied his face, searching, weighing, but Jonathan didn't hide the fear or the exhaustion. He let her see it all, and the promise underneath. She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away. Mark approached with the evidence. "He's not walking free," he said. "This sticks." Jonathan only nodded. His focus was on Mira, on the way her breathing had changed. Mark added softly, "You trusted him, Aegis. That's what stopped this from going further." Jonathan remembered the bark that froze Carl. Mira's wide eyes, and Aegis, standing like stone between danger and a child. Mira's voice finally rose, barely a whisper. "Will he hurt us again?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "Not with us here. Not with Aegis watching." Her eyes flicked between them, dog and man. Something softened. Not a smile, but the start of one. The night wind brushed past, carrying salt and old wood. Jonathan rose, brushing Aegis's fur in silent thanks. Mark gestured gently. "Get her home. She's been through enough." Jonathan bent again at the door. "Sleep if you can," he said. "Tomorrow, things change." Mira didn't speak, but her hand gripped Aegis's fur, and this time it was the shepherd who didn't let go. The hospital corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper. Rachel sat hunched at a workstation, fingers tight around a stack of fresh printouts. Under the sterile glow, what lay in black and white was anything but lifeless. Her pulse quickened as she flipped another page. Intake records, call logs, scribbled staff notes. Each line sharpened into something damning. Evelyn Sharp's name appeared again and again, her signature like a final verdict. Refused admission. Redirected patient. Rachel whispered it aloud, needing to hear the words to believe them. Elsa's name was circled in red by a weary hand. Paul, the intake nurse. The note beneath chilled her. The family insisted on urgent care. Director Sharp intervened. Admission denied. For weeks, Elsa's collapse had lived in rumor. But here, in trembling hands, was proof. Elsa hadn't been lost to illness, but to a choice. Sharp's choice. Hesitant footsteps pulled her gaze up. Paul lingered at the edge of the hall, badge crooked, shirt wrinkled. His eyes flicked from the papers to her face. "You found it," he said softly. Rachel rose, clutching the evidence. "It wasn't clerical, Paul. She was here. You logged it. Evelyn sent her away." His shoulders sagged. "I tried. I logged everything. But the director said beds were prioritized. That Elsa wasn't critical." His voice broke. "I knew it wasn't right." Rachel's tone softened, though her fire burned hotter. "You did the right thing writing it down. This," she tapped the folder, "changes everything." Behind them, a voice cut the quiet. Claire stepped forward, coat dusted with evening air, expression heavy with a truth too long dismissed. "I saw it too. Elsa begged them." She collapsed against the wall. Evelyn walked right past her. Didn't even look back. Claire's words landed like a gavel strike. She'd been ignored for weeks, called emotional, unreliable. But now her voice had a spine of paper and ink to stand on. Rachel steadied her breath. Logs. Signatures. Witnesses. This isn't speculation. It's malpractice. Negligence at the highest level. Paul shifted uneasily. "You're going after her, aren't you?" Rachel's gaze hardened. Not just her. The system that let her make that call. Elsa deserved care, not a bureaucratic death sentence. Claire's fist curled. "Then let's make sure everyone hears it." The three stood bound by grief and outrage, the sterile hum of the hospital no match for the storm rising between them. Rachel sealed the papers into a folder, as though locking away a volatile secret. She could almost see Elsa's face, the brightness extinguished, the laughter gone. This wasn't just discovery. It was a voice for someone silenced twice. Once by illness, once by power. Rachel's words broke the hush. "This isn't discovery. This is justice waiting to be written." Paul nodded, weary eyes glistening. Then write it, before Evelyn buries it deeper than we can reach. Rachel glanced toward the glass doors. For the first time in months, she didn't feel powerless. The silence choking Elsa's truth was beginning to crack, and through that crack, light poured in. At home, the clock ticked sharp against midnight. Jonathan sat alone at the kitchen table, lamp casting a yellow pool across Rachel's notes and affidavits. Aegis lay near the door, ears twitching in sleep, as though the shepherd carried his unrest. Jonathan stared at the papers, but saw another face. Emily, his daughter. The memories came mercilessly. Antiseptic, nurse's shoes squeaking, the beep of a monitor slicing silence. Her voice, small but steady, lying to protect him. Daddy, it doesn't hurt that much. He had begged for more time, shouted down sterile corridors. Policy had been their shield, excuses their armor. Emily slipped away behind red tape. Now, years later, the grief still cut raw. Regret shadowed every breath. If only I had pushed harder, kicked down the right door. Aegis stirred, pressing a cold nose to his knee. Jonathan's throat tightened as he stroked the dog's ears. "Not again, boy," he whispered. "Not with these girls. I won't let it happen again." The words hardened into vow. Mira's fragile face flashed in his mind. Elsa's faint voice, Rachel's relentless resolve. Their pain overlapped Emily's last smile. But this time, he wasn't powerless. He had evidence. He had allies. He had Aegis. He rose, pacing the floorboards. "Never again," he said, fists clenched. "Not while I'm breathing." The scars of the past gave him clarity. Truth only mattered if dragged into light, held until no one could look away. Jonathan crouched beside Aegis, gripping the shepherd's neck. "We couldn't save her," he murmured, "but we can save them." The dog pressed his head against Jonathan's chest, and for a moment the ache eased, grief tempered by purpose. Jonathan sat again, pulled paper toward him, and began to write. Not notes, not evidence, but a vow. Not again, not with these girls. He folded the page and slid it into his wallet. A promise, pressed close to his heart. For the first time in years, he breathed without the crushing weight of helplessness. Emily was no longer just a wound. She was a compass. Jonathan looked at Aegis. "This time," he said, voice steady, "we're not losing." The law office smelled of ink and old paper, the air heavy with history. Rachel sat at the oak table, sleeves rolled, glasses slipping as she sifted through files spread like battle maps. Jonathan leaned forward, grim resolve in his posture. Across from them sat Mira, small and tense, hands clenched white. Aegis sprawled at her feet, steady as stone. Rachel's voice was sharp. "We have enough. Evelyn denied Elsa care. Logs confirm it. Paul saw her. Claire heard her. Witnesses and records, grounds for malpractice and ethics violation." She tapped her pen on another file. "Carl's evidence, the jewelry box, the crowbar, ties theft to intimidation. Side by side, we don't just go after actions. We show a culture of abuse and neglect." Jonathan frowned. Sharp has an influence. Carl has fear. That's their weapon. Rachel's gaze softened toward Mira. "That's why testimony matters. Claire agreed to stand, knowing the risks. With yours, Mira, their silence collapses." Mira's eyes flickered. "She'll really do it?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, She's done hiding, and your voice is what they tried hardest to silence. That's why it matters most. Mira's trembling hand found Aegis's fur. The shepherd nudged her arm, urging her toward courage. Jonathan leaned closer. We're fighting for you, for Elsa, for every silence they forced. This time, they didn't walk away. A tear slipped down Mira's cheek. She wiped it fast, but Jonathan only met her with steady eyes, asking for nothing but trust. Rachel slid a folder across the table. Inside lay Mira's statement, typed and waiting. This is your story. You decide how much the court hears. But remember, your silence is exactly what they depended on. Mira opened it, breath catching. For so long she had carried fear like a second skin. Now her words would stand in light, not as a weapon against her, but as shields for others. Jonathan's chest ached with the echo of Emily, of vows broken long ago. But this time he would not lose. Rachel stacked the files neatly, snapping the case box shut. We will file tomorrow. The court will set a date within weeks. Evelyn will claim medical discretion. Carl will deny, maybe threaten. But we counter with proof, testimony, truth. They built their power on intimidation. We dismantle it with light. The room settled into silence before the storm. Outside, the city glowed indifferently. Jonathan placed his hand over Mira's fists. Whatever happens, you're not alone. Her eyes met his, then Rachel's. Then Aegis's tail thumped once against the floor. Mira exhaled, shaky, but resolute. Then let's fight. Rachel's lips curved faintly. That's the spirit the court needs to see. And as the case box closed, it sounded like a door sealing shut. Behind them, silence and fear. Ahead, the noise of justice. For the first time, Mira felt the tide shift. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee gone cold. Every shuffle of paper, every scrape of chair legs, echoed beneath the high ceilings, as though silence itself carried judgment. At the bench sat Judge Miriam Hale, her robe falling in crisp folds, her gaze sharp enough to slice through pretense. Known for her unflinching fairness, she scanned the docket, then the faces before her. The gallery sat packed, reporters, townspeople, hospital staff, all pulled here by the gravity of what this day meant. At the petitioner's table, Jonathan Hale sat upright, shoulders tense, hands folded. Beside him were the sisters, Mira, older but still so fragile, and Elsa, clutching the hem of his sleeve. At their feet, Aegis lay stretched across the floor, his amber eyes sweeping the room with quiet vigilance. His presence, allowed only by Judge Hale's nod, was no ornament. He was an anchor and shield. All rise, the clerk intoned. Bodies lifted in unison. This court convenes to hear two matters, Judge Hale began, her voice calm but resonant. The guardianship petition for minors, Mira and Elsa Whitcomb, and the charges against Evelyn Sharp and Carl Vance. The words fell heavy. This was not just paperwork or signatures. This was about lives broken, and whether they could be set right. Rachel rose first, her voice clear. She presented the evidence with surgical precision. Hospital intake logs. Evelyn Sharp's signature scrawled over refusals of urgent care. Paul's testimony that Elsa was turned away. Claire's sworn statement that she watched the girl collapse while Sharp walked past. Piece by piece, the puzzle built itself into something irrefutable. The facts show Rachel concluded, that Dr. Evelyn Sharp willfully denied life-saving treatment in violation of both medical ethics and human decency. Sharp sat rigid at the defense table, jaw locked, fingers twined tightly together. For years she had wielded authority as a weapon. Now, stripped of pretense, her silence spoke louder than any defense. Judge Hale leaned forward. This court finds Dr. Sharp guilty of gross negligence and ethical malpractice. Your medical license is permanently revoked. You will serve probation under restriction of practice for 3 years, with imprisonment upon violation. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sharp's face drained pale. Her once commanding presence shrunk to something small and brittle. She tried to rise, to protest, but her attorney's hand pressed her back down. Her reign was finished. Then came Carl Vance. Shackled, broad shoulders hunched, he sneered as the judge's gaze turned his way. His defiance had colored every moment of trial. Interruptions, curses, glares that aimed to wound. "Carl Vance," Judge Hale intoned, "you stand convicted of abuse, theft, and intimidation. This court sentences you to 12 years in state prison." The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Carl's eyes swept the room until they locked on Mira. The old cruelty lit his gaze. Venom aimed to make her flinch. For a moment, her breath caught, shoulders stiffening. But before fear could root, Jonathan shifted, a broad frame blocking Carl's line of sight. Behind him, Mark stood ready, steady as stone. Carl's stare broke against their presence. His power was gone. The bailiffs hauled him up. His shackles clinked, his muttered threats drowned beneath the scrape of chairs. As he was dragged away, Mira sagged against Jonathan, her tears spilling not from fear, but from release. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Judge Hale removed her glasses, turning her gaze to the petitioner's table. Now to the guardianship petition. Mr. Hale, Mira, Elsa. Do you understand what this decision will mean? Mira's voice wavered but held. It means we will stay with him. She glanced toward Jonathan. And is that what you want? Yes, Your Honor, she whispered. Elsa nodded hard, her small hand gripping Jonathan's. Jonathan rose slowly when invited to speak. His voice, though low, carried through the chamber. Your Honor, I am no perfect man. I carry scars, mistakes. But I made a promise when these girls came under my care. A promise that what happened to them before, neglect, abandonment, fear, would never happen again. I can't give them back what they've lost. But I can give them safety. I can give them family. I swear to you, to them, they will never walk this world alone. He faltered then, glancing down. Elsa pressed close to his side. Mira lifted her tear-filled eyes to his, searching. What she found there steadied her. Judge Hale's expression softened, the steel of the bench giving way to something nearly maternal. Do you feel safe with him? She asked gently. Elsa answered first, clear as a bell. Yes. He listens. He doesn't leave. Mira's reply was quieter, but no less strong. He stays. The gavel tapped once. Then this court grants full guardianship of Mira and Elsa Whitcomb to Mr. Jonathan Hale, effective immediately. The words broke over the room like sunlight after a storm. Mira let out a sob she hadn't realized she was holding, clutching Jonathan's arm. Elsa buried her face in his chest. Aegis thumped his tail once against the polished floor, as if sealing the decree himself. Judge Hale leaned forward, her sternness softening into something like benediction. Welcome home, young ladies. The phrase struck like a bell. Mira dissolved into tears, Elsa whimpered softly, and Jonathan bowed his head, swallowing back his own. For so long, every step had been about survival, fighting threats, shielding the girls. But in that instant, it wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about belonging. The gavel cracked one final time. Court is adjourned. Reporters pressed forward the moment the doors opened. Cameras flashed, questions flew. But Jonathan shielded the girls, Mark flanking, Rachel answering only briefly. The children are safe. That is all that matters. On the courthouse steps, winter air cut sharp against their cheeks. Mira hesitated, glancing up at Jonathan. "What if he comes back someday?" she whispered. Jonathan squeezed her shoulder gently. "Then we'll still be here. Me, Aegis, everyone who stood with you today. You're not alone anymore. Not ever." The words sank into her like a shield. Not just promise, but truth. Elsa tugged on Jonathan's sleeve, eyes wide. "We don't have to pack anymore?" Jonathan laughed softly through tears. "No, sweetheart. No more packing." They moved down the steps together. Man, girls, and dog. Sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling across them in a warm wash as if the world itself echoed the judge's words. "Welcome home." And for the first time, Mira's steps did not falter. The cabin was quiet when they returned, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Snow tapped lightly against the windows, not a storm this time, but a hush that wrapped the night in peace. Jonathan set his coat on the hook by the door, glancing back as Mira and Elsa stepped inside. Their shoes left small prints across the wooden floorboards. They hesitated for a moment, as though unsure if they were really allowed to belong here. "Go on," Jonathan said softly, his voice almost breaking. "It's your home now. Explore it." Elsa's eyes widened. She darted into the living room, running her hand along the back of the worn sofa, as if testing whether it was real. Mira followed more slowly, fingertips brushing the edge of the dining table. Aegis trotted in behind them, shaking snow from his coat before settling with a sigh in front of the fire. Jonathan busied himself at the stove, more to steady his hands than to make food. He poured milk into mugs, heating it until steam curled lazily upward. The clink of ceramic seemed louder than usual. He kept thinking of the judge's words, "Welcome home, young ladies," and how they still rang in his chest like a bell he never wanted silenced. When he turned, both girls were curled on the rug beside Aegis. Elsa leaned against his broadside, half asleep already, while Mira stroked the dog's ear absent-mindedly, staring into the flames. Her shoulders, once always hunched, were beginning, just barely, to loosen. Jonathan set the mugs down gently. "Warm milk," he said, sitting with them. Elsa stirred, yawning before sipping carefully. Mira lifted her mug, holding it between both hands, as though the warmth itself was something she hadn't felt in years. They sat together like that for a long while, the fire crackling, the dog's slow breathing steady. At last, Mira whispered, "It doesn't feel real." Jonathan's chest tightened. What doesn't? Being safe. She looked up at him, eyes glimmering in the firelight. It always felt like it could end any second, like someone could knock on the door and take us away again. He reached over, placing his hand gently on hers. "No one's taking you anywhere. Not anymore. You're home. This is where you get to grow, to rest, to just be kids." Elsa, drowsy, murmured into Aegis's fur, "We don't have to hide anymore?" Jonathan bent close, brushing her hair back from her forehead. No, sweetheart. Not ever again. Mira's lips trembled, but this time not from fear. She leaned into his side, resting her head against his shoulder. For the first time since he'd met her, Jonathan felt her weight fully there. No flinch, no guarded distance, just trust. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint chime of branches brushing against the roof. Inside, the three of them sat bound together by warmth and silence that was no longer empty, but whole. Aegis raised his head once, scanning the room, then laid it back down with a satisfied sigh. His tail thumped once, slow and certain. Jonathan looked from the fire to the girls, then upward, as if speaking to someone no longer there. Emily, we made it. They're safe. And for the first time in years, the ache in his chest eased. Not gone, but softened into something livable. When the fire burned low and sleep pulled at their eyes, Jonathan rose and guided them to bed. Elsa crawled beneath the quilt, Mira tucked in beside her. Aegis curled at the foot of the bed, his body curved protectively around them. Jonathan lingered in the doorway, watching as Mira whispered something that made Elsa giggle, their voices light as wind chimes. The sound filled the cabin, filling cracks that had sat empty for too long. "Good night," he said quietly. "Good night," Mira whispered back. Jonathan turned off the light. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and unthreatening. And in that cabin, for the first time, the word family did not feel borrowed. It was theirs. Sometimes, the most extraordinary love comes from the quiet loyalty of a dog. German shepherds, with their courage and devotion, remind us that family isn't just who we're born with, but also those who choose to walk beside us, four paws and all. Their watchful eyes, their unshakable loyalty, and the way they simply stay through our hardest days speak louder than words ever could. If you've ever felt that bond, you know it's something sacred. And if you'd like to explore ways to connect more deeply with your own dog, whether through understanding their needs better, building trust, or simply spending more meaningful moments together, I came across a resource that might help. It's nothing fancy, just a place full of thoughtful ideas and guidance for people who truly love their dogs. Take a look when you feel like it. No pressure, just a gentle suggestion from one dog lover to another. Because in the end, the greatest gift we can give them is the same gift they've always given us: our time, our patience, and our heart.